Night falls over the Viking world. The wind moves slowly through the tall grass, whispering across the dark hills of the north. Somewhere far away, waves crash against the rocky shore. A raven calls once, then goes silent. And rising out of their earth, like the back of some ancient creature sleeping beneath the soil, stands a burial mound. Round, silent, older than the farmhouse nearby. In daylight, it looks almost peaceful. A green hill where sheep might graze, where wild flowers push through the soil in summer. But at night, it feels different. The shadows cling to it. The air seems heavier. And if you were walking past one of these mounds in the Viking Age, you would keep your distance just like the rest of the North. People never walked over them. They walked around them. The long way around. Even warriors who didn't fear a blade, or sailors who laughed in the face of storms, they would step aside and walk off the path, and they would keep their distance, because the Vikings didn't fear many things, but they did fear the dead. Not just any dead, the living dead. Vikings believed that beneath those mounds lay more than bones, more than treasure belonging to the deceased, more than memory and remains. They believed some graves were not completely dead. Some graves waited and watched. Today on Viking Legacy and Lore, we're exploring the dark side of Viking burial mounds. Towering graves raised for warriors and kings. The place where swords, silver, ships, and sometimes even animals and servants were buried beside the dead. Burial mounds were places people whispered about. Places where no one dared disturb. The reason was that some of these graves were said to move, to speak, and even rise again. But this isn't the Christian version of resurrection. There's no glory here, only corruption. Because in the Viking imagination, death didn't always mean rest. Sometimes the grave became a prison, a sentence to be lived out in torment. But what happens when the tormented didn't stay in the grave? One of the most chilling stories from the Viking world begins with a woman who stood alone beneath the night sky, who dared to wake the dead. Her name was Hervor. If there was ever a soul made of granite and ice instead of flesh and bone, it was hers. She was not made for the winter loom or the grind of domestic life. She was made for the open world, for iron and steel in her hands, for the kind of choices that sensible people would never make. Hervor was the sort of woman who heard a warning and mistook it for an invitation. And so she came to the island, not by accident, not blown there by some storm or misfortune. She came because she wanted what the island had to offer. And when she desired something, there was nothing that anyone could do to stop her. The island lay apart from the world, like a forgotten chunk of land untouched, lonely and cold. Black stone shores lined the coast, and there was no village there. No cattle grazed, no children ran laughing over the hills. It was the sort of place even gulls seemed reluctant to land, as though the air itself whispered old instructions. Do not linger here. At the island's heart stood the mound. It rose from the earth like a scar from a wound that had healed badly. Beneath the dirt lay Ungantir, the great warrior who had a fierce reputation and legendary weapon that just happened to be cursed. Ungantir was buried with this special sword. This unique blade, it brought glory and ruin in equal measure. It was forged with a curse folded into its metal like poison mixed with mead. The attribute that made the weapon formidable was the fact that it would never miss. It would cut through iron and bone with no resistance. But every life that wielded it ended the same way, in grief. So when Ungantir died, they buried the sword and the curse with him. The sun set on the forbidden island, and darkness blanketed the mound. Hervor, she reached the grave alone. The sea thrashing at the cliffs below, the wind moved through the coarse grass, bending it low to the earth. The sky starved of light by the thick clouds overhead. She stood before the mound, contemplating her next move, because this is not one of those stories where the hero gathers companions for courage and someone says, "This feels like a bad idea," and then everyone laughs and proceeds anyway. No, Hervor came by herself. which is either bravery in its purest form or madness dressed in rugged Viking Age garb. She planted her feet at the edge of the raised ground and called out into the dark. She called for her father. She was the child of Angantyr. She spoke out as if he was a man, as if he could hear her, as if he would respond out of ancestral duty. She was there only to claim the family heirloom that was trapped in her father's grave. The wind answered first. A gust blew her cloak and her hair sideways. Then stillness and silence. Then something changed. Something shifted. The air filled with an unmistakable smell, a choking stench that seemed to linger too long. The night had grown cold. The first crystals of frost began to form. One moment she was alone. The next, she realized she never was. There were dozens of eyes, unseen, yet peering into this encounter. The ground beneath her boots trembled. She held her breath, and then the mound began to burn. It was not like a warm fire of a hearth, nor was it like a blaze out of control. This fire that began to come from the mound, it was strange, it was different. The tongues of fire crept up from the burial mound, blue and red, mixed with white, pure white, as if something deep inside the grave had woken and was beginning to push its way out. The grass around the mound swelled. Smoke, steam, and the smell of hot earth filled the air. But the wind didn't carry it away. It hung there, wrapped around the mound like a heavy veil. Most people standing there in the dark with a grave burning in front of them would have turned around. Hervor did not. She took another step closer. The fire threw flames higher, creating moving shadows over her face, and for a moment she looked less like a woman and more like a warrior carved from solid ash wood and destined to acquire the sword of her father. The mound opened like a mouth, ready to consume everything nearby. She stood resolute, the cold brightness of her eyes stared with anticipation. Surely she was afraid, surely she would flinch. Only a fool feels nothing before a grave that contains more than just the dead. But in the north, there is a species of courage that doesn't listen to fear, or flee even if fate demands a life. This kind of courage drags fear out of its god-forsaken cave, stares it straight in the eyes, and smirks like it's never been impressed. Hervor embodied this type of courage. Again, she called to the mound, "Angantyr!" This time, from inside the grave came the voice. It wasn't loud. It came muffled through the earth, deep and heavy like sound pushing upward through the soil. It was the voice of a man who had laid too long with his thoughts, the voice of something still holding shape after it should have dissolved. He asked why she disturbed him. Hervor didn't hesitate. She told him exactly why she had come. She wanted the sword. At that, the dead man's voice changed. "Who goes there and makes such demands?" The voice carried a tone that suggested a wrong answer wouldn't end well. "I'm here for the sword. It belongs to me," Hervor replied. "It belongs to no one. The sword is wielded, but is not owned." Angantyr spoke with a fierce, firm voice. "That sword is mine, and I will use it however I see fit," Hervor replied. She continued, "My father fought many battles with that sword, and now it's my turn." Angantyr warned her. He told her the sword was cursed, told her that it ruined the strongest and greatest men, told her death clung to it like the grip of a fierce warrior. Angantyr said, "No hand has ever taken hold of the sword without eventually paying for the privilege in their own blood." Now this may be the only example in Norse lore where the grave and the undead were trying to be helpful. Hervor refused the kindness and ignored the warning. She demanded the sword again, this time with her hand on the hilt of her blade. She gripped ready to enter and ready to fight. Angantyr spoke again. "I have seen what this blade does. I know the pattern. I have paid the price. You'll have to come get it. Your survival here is not guaranteed either. But what is sealed is the fate of all those who possess this crude piece of metal." Hervor was just like her father and immune to caution. She was fixated on retrieving the sword. This isn't the only piece of doomed metal in Norse lore. And just like Andvari's ring, destruction gets passed on to the next person who craves the power. The fire on the mound continued to burn, and the flames rose higher. The earth cracked wider, and a black crevice appeared. Onguntir's voice bellowed grim and final. Leave. Still, Hervor would not yield. She stood there on the forsaken island, with the sea beating the rocks below and the mound blazing before her. She wasn't leaving without that sword. She didn't come to plead. She didn't come to bargain. She didn't care who stood in her way. She yelled into the flames and demanded, one last time, return the sword to the only living heir of Unguntir. The sword emerged. It emerged from the mound, not gently, not ceremoniously. It came from the fire, like judgment. Hervor reached out and took it in her hand. The flames recoiled, the breeze returned, and the fog lifted. The voice from the mound gave its final warning. Keep it if you must. Use it if you dare, but know what you carry will lay all to bear. Blood, betrayal, and bitter ruin is not merely a weapon. It is a sentence. And with that, the fire was sucked back into the earth instantly. The flames withdrew, the smoke disappeared, the mound stood dark once more. The island returned to its silence, just the surf, wind, and creatures of the night. But nothing was the same. Hervor turned from the grave with the most powerful sword ever created in her grasp. She had gotten what she came for. She turned, standing, looking out from the cliff at the dark shore and the black waves. Behind her lay the mound, sealed again with the remains of a dead warrior who for a moment was anything but. Before her lay a long road of battles and adventure, though now she walked in the shadow of the curse that she had chosen to carry. What became of Hervor, we may never know. Or maybe one day we'll uncover a saga that reveals whether she succeeded or she succumbed to the curse. In many of the sagas, the dead could speak, and places that should have been the final resting place were anything but restful. A warrior buried with honor was not always imagined as drifting peacefully into the afterlife. Sometimes he remained, aware, a presence beneath the earth, watching the world that had gone on without him. That idea may sound strange to modern ears, but to the Norse it made a perfect kind of sense. Think about it. A man who spent his entire life fighting, commanding men in battle, winning fight after fight. Why should such a soul become quiet and harmless the moment dirt was piled over his grave? When you mix this with other Norse views of the afterlife, like Odin's Valkyries and Freya's selection of the dead, we learn that there is a difference between those who die in honor, having lived and died with bravery, and those who lived in such a way that broke the code and defied the norms of Viking Age culture. In any case, the most common form of burial for the honored, for the wealthy, was the burial mound. Many during the Viking Age believed that powerful personalities did not fade easily. They didn't always catch the first ferry to the afterlife, especially if they weren't buried with their own ship. The Norse believed the strong personalities, good or bad, had a way of lingering, sticking around. The only question was, how would they interact with the living if their paths ever crossed? The sagas are filled with stories of burial mounds that seemed almost alive. Mounds that glowed at night. Mounds where strange lights flickered under the grass. Mounds where travelers claimed they heard voices when the wind blew a certain way. Some of those stories were probably exaggerations, passed along over generations, changing ever so slightly each time. But the fact that they were told, it all reveals something deeper about Viking belief. Burial mounds were not always peaceful places. They were places that remembered power. And since the mounds were reserved for the rich and the famous, they were also full of treasure. And treasure in the ground can be a tempting thing. Grave robbers were all too common back in the Viking Age, that these stories about the dead rising were told to create an invisible boundary, trying to keep thieves away. And if the stories didn't work, then a guard would have been hired to watch and wait and handle the thieves with swift judgment. So the stories that we hear from the sagas very well may have had their roots in reality. And we'll talk more about that theory in a moment. But before we get to the mystery and the danger of the burial mounds, the darker side of burial mounds, the reason Vikings built them in the first place was to create a visual monument to the dead. These mounds could be seen from great distances, and they were permanent reminders of heritage. Another function would be landmarks for territory and land ownership. If your grandfather was buried in that mound, then the land clearly belongs to your descendants. So when we step away from the sagas for a moment and we just look at archaeological history, they tell us what the burial mounds meant to the Viking Age. We see that the truth becomes much clearer. And across Scandinavia and the wider Norse world, burial mounds were some of the most impressive monuments people could build. They were not simply just graves. They were enormous earthworks, sometimes towering hills of soil and stone constructed to hold bodies of important individuals. So chiefs, war leaders, powerful families. These mounds could take days, weeks, even months to construct. Entire communities would participate in building them. Soil was hauled, stones were arranged, layers of earth were packed down until the mound stood visible across the surrounding land. If you traveled through the Viking world 1,000 years ago, you would see them everywhere. On hilltops, along coastlines, beside farms and villages, a burial mound was a statement. It said that something powerful lies here. But also said something else, something important once used to reside in this land. In a world where written record was rare, the landscape itself became the archive of memory. Burial mounds acted like gravestones and territorial markers. They reminded everyone who passed through this place that it had history, that powerful ancestors were connected to the land, and that their descendants still lived there. In other words, burial mounds were not just about death, they were about legacy. Inside the mounds, archaeologists have found incredible collections of swords, spears, shields, and sometimes entire sets of armor accompanied the warrior in the grave. Jewelry and silver were also buried, especially with powerful men and women. Arm rings, brooches, necklaces, coins that reflected both wealth and status. Tools were included as well. Axes, knives, and everyday objects followed their owners into the afterlife. Perhaps it meant to serve them in the next world just as it had in their life. Sometimes the burials were even more elaborate. Ships were occasionally placed inside burial mounds, their wooden hulls carefully laid in the earth before being covered with soil. Archaeology confirms just how significant these mounds were to the families of the Viking Age. One of the most famous discoveries is the Osberg ship buried in Norway. Inside a massive mound, archaeologists uncovered an entire Viking ship filled with grave goods, carved sleds, wagons, textiles, household objects, and intricate woodwork. The burial likely belonged to a high-status woman, perhaps even a queen. Another famous find was the Gokstad ship burial, also in Norway. Here, a powerful chieftain had been laid to rest inside a full-size Viking ship surrounded by weapons, horses, and valuable equipment. The ship itself was built for ocean travel, suggesting that the dead man was meant to sail on into the afterlife. Even outside Scandinavia, we see similar traditions. Burial mounds are found in England, Scotland, Germany, Isles of Man, Latvia, Estonia, and Iceland. So burial mounds spread beyond Scandinavia to wherever the Vikings ended up. What all these burials reveal is simple, that they were not random graves. They were monuments to wealth, to honor, to memory. But those same qualities, they created a problem. Because when you bury treasure, people notice. A mound visible for miles isn't just a monument, it's also a sign. And you don't need a map to find it. Mounds were clear beacons that somewhere beneath the earth lies silver, weapons, jewelry, and valuable objects. And where there is treasure, there are always people willing to risk everything to get it. Grave robbing was not uncommon in the Viking world. In fact, many burial mounds show clear signs of having been opened, sometimes only a few years after burial itself. Robbers tunneled into the mound from the side or dug straight down from the top in hopes of reaching the burial chamber. Some were successful, others may have been chased away, or worse. But the temptation was always there. And now, we're going to dig and discover the darker side of Viking burial mounds. Because some mounds held more than just those who died in honor. And some grave robbers may have even found their way into the sagas and created an entire lore surrounding Viking Age zombies, called draugrs. Not every mound was home to those who died of natural causes. Many animals have been found killed and buried in the mounds. Horses were the most common. The horse would be led to the grave, killed and laid near the deceased. Was it a sacrifice, or was it buried alongside their master ready to carry them into the world beyond? It may be impossible to know for sure. Dogs are also common. They were killed in the grave to journey with their owner into the next life. Cattle, sheep, and other animals would have been found there as well. And if that feels heavy, well, it's about to get heavier, because not everything that was buried in those mounds went there willingly. There is a historical account of a woman, a slave, a mistress, being led to the grave of her master and killed and buried alongside of his body. There is also evidence in archaeological discoveries that show multiple bodies buried together, which may suggest that the wife of the deceased, slaves or concubines, were led and buried alongside the powerful. The reason this makes sense is that these extra bodies often have wounds that suggest they didn't die of natural causes. As dark as that is, there's a darker element to consider with the grave robbers. They hunted these burial mounds. They hunted in the same way that others would have hunted whales or walruses. They knew, powerful warriors, that they were buried with weapons and silver and jewelry. And sometimes there were rumors of objects that carried supernatural power. They traveled the land in the shadows looking for fortune. And when they found it, they dug. They dug into the earth and they sifted through bones and rotten flesh in hopes of finding something of value, removing jewelry straight from the dead. Now, moving that much dirt and sifting through the dead would take days, if not weeks, to get everything of value. These grave robbers would have been covered in dirt and death, and they disturbed these sites because of greed and desperation. This is where I believe some of the stories of the draugr came from, or at least went from entertaining fireside stories to viable, plausible, and confirmed on multiple occasions. When these stories of the living dead, of the draugr, when they started, we may not be able to prove. But the Vikings clearly believed that the disturbing the dead was dangerous, not just spiritually, physically, because many people thought the dead might defend their mound. The sagas describe this terrifying being, what we might call a zombie. It was an undead guardian who remained tied to the grave and the treasure buried with them. And these were not ghosts. They had physical bodies, heavy bodies, massive strength. The stories say a draugr could crush a man's bones, break weapons in its grip, drag intruders back into the grave and kill them. Some were said to grow larger in death, swelling with rage and bitterness. Others carried curses that followed anyone foolish enough to steal from their burial mound. But this is where things get interesting, because when we step back from the legend and look at the realities of Viking life, the line between superstition and practical explanation, it begins to blur. And that blur is where the dark side of the burial mound lives. We know that silver was the lifeblood of the Viking world. It was money, it was reputation, it was freedom. Burial mounds were like a man puffing out his chest even after they were dead to prove they had accumulated great wealth in their life. But men without silver, they remained nobodies. And the mounds scattered across the countryside sometimes contained exactly what desperate men needed. But what happens when the family decides that their mound, their monument to the dead, will not be the victim of grave robbers? Now, I want you to imagine your father, the greatest chieftain central Norway has ever had. At least that's how the landowners viewed him. And he was buried in a mound with much of what he had accumulated. You're a respected warrior and second in line to inherit everything your father left. His burial was meant to honor him and display the family's status and remind everyone in this region who your family is and what the success of the region owes to your father. And now, only 6 nights after the mound was completed, someone is trying to steal away your family's honor, and more than that, desecrate the remains. In a society built on reputation, that is not an act that goes unpunished. So what do? Watch the mound from the shadows. Wait to see if when darkness falls over the land, if the robbers come. And they do. And so now what? What do? Do you yell at them and try to scare them off? No. Because they think you're another grave robber competing for the spoils, and they're 2 of them and 1 of you. Or do you come out of the shadows and punish the grave robber closest to you, slashing, making terrible sounds, and making a spectacle of it before turning to the second robber who is standing there in shock with blood on your face and the moonlight hitting just right, and the second robber catches a glimpse of something that looks other than human, drops his shovel, and he runs for his life? And what would the results of that be? Well, months later, You hear a rumor that spreads about your father's burial mound, that it's haunted, that your father's alive and thirsty for blood, and if anyone ventures too close, they'll meet their doom. You realize the truth of the rumor. You don't correct it. You simply let the story be an invisible barrier around your father's grave, and maybe other graves across the region. The legend of the draugr defending its grave suddenly makes perfect sense. But given enough time, the art of storytelling, and an oral society that is enthralled with its stories, it makes even more sense that the draugr and burial mounds turned into epic tales that still exist today. So what do we make of all this? Burial mounds in the Viking world were many things all at once. Monuments raised for the memory of great warriors, tombs holding bodies of chiefs, sailors, and kings who once shaped the world of the living. And they were symbols of power, reminders carved into the land itself that someone important once ruled here. But in the Viking imagination, there was something more. They were doors between the living and the dead. Most mounds held honored ancestors, heroes remembered in stories and song, but others carried darker reputations, mounds that glowed at night, mounds that travelers avoided, mounds where the wind sometimes sounded a little too much like a voice beneath the soil. Because the Vikings believed disturbing the wrong grave could awaken something that should have stayed buried. And whether those stories were warnings, superstitions, or echoes of something people once thought they saw, one thing is certain: those mounds still stand today across Scandinavia, quiet, grass-covered, watching the centuries pass, and every one of them holds a story written beneath the earth. If you want to hear more and haven't already listened to episode 1, The Saga Vikings Feared Most, you're going to get two things: an episode about Viking draugrs from an Icelandic saga, and you'll get to experience one of the first episodes that launched this podcast. If you enjoyed exploring the dark side of Viking burial mounds, share this episode with someone who loves history and the Viking Age, and let this episode be its own monument. Leave a review so people can discover Viking Legacy and Lore. This is a treasure that we're not trying to keep buried. We want to share with fans of history and all those who love the incredible world of the Viking Age, because there are still thousands of stories waiting to be told. And remember, the past is never as dead as it seems. History can come alive if you tell the story the right way. And until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.